A variable is basically a container for information, so you are able to reference it later in your code without restating it. A variable has three main parts. The first part is whether it is public or private, the second part is the type of variable, and the third part is the name of the variable. Basically, public means that a variable will show up and be changeable in the inspector thing, private means that it won't. You don't always need to specify public or private. If you put nothing down, it will default to private. The name is also pretty simple. You can call anything whatever you want, but it would be a good idea to name it something that would make sense so you don't forget what it does. The type of variable, which I believe is called the class, is a little more complicated because there are a lot of different ones that are all used for different things. First, integer, or int, is used for whole numbers like 1, 2, or 6753. This is good for measuring things like days or years. Another type you can use with numbers is called decimal. This is obviously used for numbers with decimals in them. This is good for things like weight or height. Decimal should only be used with smaller numbers that only have a few decimal places. If you get into huge numbers with extremely precise decimals, you should use something called a float. These are good for precise calculations. It is important to remember that when you are using a decimal, you have to put a capital letter M at the end of your number, and with a float you have to put a lowercase letter f at the end. If you forget to do this, C# will have no idea what you are trying to do. Now let's say you're not storing a number, instead you want to store a word. For this you use something called a string, which is good for storing names and any other words you want to store. Another type is called a boolean, or bool, and that is basically just an easier way of saying true or false. All of the things I have mentioned are things that work in all or most programming languages, but Unity also has some things that you wouldn't find in other languages. The first one being GameObject. This is basically a way to reference an object that you created in the Unity editor. All you have to do is drag the object into the space you created in the inspector. Transform is another type of object, and it is very similar to GameObject. The main difference that I could find is that a transform is more efficient because you can get updated values every frame. An example of why this is important is when I was trying to make an enemy with homing attacks. I used GameObject instead of transform, and the projectiles would track to the player's spawn point and not the player.